Power doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It slips into rooms quietly, sitting at tables where decisions affecting thousands, sometimes millions, are made. And here's the truth. Many won't tell you the most dangerous person in that room isn't always the one with evil intent. Have you ever watched someone make a catastrophic mistake not because they wanted to cause harm, but because they simply didn't know what they didn't know? The fool in power doesn't recognize the boundaries of their own understanding. They mistake confidence for competence. And while the evil person might be stopped by their conscience or the fear of consequences, the fool charges ahead, wrapped in the warm blanket of their own certainty. What's the difference between foolishness and evil? Evil knows it's causing harm. Foolishness believes it's doing good. I once witnessed a business owner, let's call him Robert, who inherited his father's manufacturing company. 75 employees, 3 generations of customers, a community fixture. Robert wasn't malicious, he wanted success, but he refused to learn what he didn't know about the changing market. We've always done it this way, became his mantra. Within 18 months, the doors closed. 75 families without income. Not because Robert was evil, because he was foolish. Ask yourself, in your areas of responsibility, are you learning or leaning on what you already know? The foolish leader creates victims by accident, and sometimes those accidents are more devastating than intentional harm because no one saw them coming. No one prepared. No one built defenses. Think about this. When someone shows you they're evil, at least you know to protect yourself. The fool catches you off guard every time. Your position, whether you're managing a household budget or running a corporation, multiplies your impact. Your decisions create ripples that travel farther than you can see. The higher your position, the further those ripples extend. That's the nature of power. Consider this fundamental equation: impact equals power multiplied by decisions. Even small authority combined with foolish choices creates substantial negative consequences. When I was starting out, I worked under a supervisor who made promises to clients without consulting the production team. Was he trying to harm the company? No. He wanted to please the customers, meet targets, earn bonuses. Good intentions. But his foolishness created impossible deadlines, burnt out staff, and eventually lost accounts. His power, modest in the grand scheme, multiplied his poor judgment into company-wide problems. Now flip that equation. Power multiplied by wisdom creates opportunity, growth, progress. The wise person in authority becomes a force for positive change precisely because their influence extends. What separates wisdom from foolishness? It's not intelligence. Some of the most educated people make the most foolish decisions. It's not experience alone either. I've known people who've repeated the same mistakes for decades and called it experience. The difference is self-awareness and the willingness to recognize patterns. Patterns govern everything. Success leaves clues. So does failure. The fool misses the patterns or ignores them. The wise person studies them, learns from them, adjusts accordingly. You've seen this play out. The department head who keeps hiring the wrong people, creating the same team problems year after year. The parent who reacts with the same ineffective discipline technique while expecting different results. The politician who applies failed policies to new problems, genuinely shocked when they fail again. None of these people intend harm. They're not twirling villainous mustaches. They're making decisions based on limited understanding while believing they have complete understanding. That's the essence of foolishness in power. And that combination, authority without awareness, creates more destruction than virtually any other force in human affairs. Think about the worst boss you've ever had. Were they evil? Or were they simply unable to see how their actions affected others? Were they malicious? Or just marinating in their own limited perspective? For most of you, I suspect it was the latter, the fool in charge. Now the uncomfortable question, where are you the fool in charge? Where do you have responsibility without the requisite wisdom? Because we all have those areas, if we're honest enough to admit them. I certainly do. Years ago, I found myself giving financial advice to friends, despite having no real financial education myself. I wasn't trying to harm anyone. I genuinely wanted to help, but my good intentions combined with my position of trust created real consequences in people's lives. Some took actions based on my uninformed opinions that cost them thousands. The day I realized what I'd done was the day I committed to never again speaking with authority on subjects where I possessed only opinions. Power magnifies everything, including our blind spots. Even modest authority gives weight to your words and actions. When you speak, people listen differently than they would if you held no position. When you act, your example becomes a template others might follow. This is true whether you're a parent, a team leader, a community organizer, or a CEO. The patterns that govern success and failure operate the same at every level. They're as consistent as gravity. Drop something, it falls. Make decisions without adequate understanding. While holding power, people get hurt. But just as physical laws can be used to build rather than destroy, to launch rockets instead of creating crashes, the patterns of power can generate extraordinary positive outcomes when harnessed with wisdom. What does that wisdom look like in practice? First, it requires accurate self-assessment. The fool in power overestimates their capabilities. They believe they can solve problems beyond their understanding. They think knowledge in one area transfers automatically to expertise in another. Have you noticed how lottery winners often lose everything within a few years? They gain financial power without financial wisdom. Their newfound authority over large sums of money combined with their lack of financial understanding creates predictable disasters. The same principle applies everywhere. Power exists. The parent who never addresses their own emotional issues brings those unresolved patterns into their child raising. The manager who hasn't learned communication skills creates team dysfunction. The community leader who doesn't understand group dynamics inadvertently creates division. None of these people want negative outcomes, but wanting doesn't change results. Only changing inputs changes outputs. This brings us to the second aspect of wisdom and power, the willingness to seek counsel. The fool believes independence is strength. The wise understand that interdependence, knowing when and how to draw on others' expertise, creates resilience. I've noticed something fascinating about truly successful people. The more responsibility they gain, the more questions they ask. The higher they rise, the more willing they are to acknowledge what they don't know. Meanwhile, those stalled in their growth often have all the answers already. They have power without curiosity, authority without inquiry, and that combination rarely ends well for anyone involved. Consider this pattern throughout history. Civilizations that stopped learning, stopped thriving. Companies that believed they had nothing new to understand disappeared. Individuals who decided they had arrived stagnated. The fool in power stops growing. The wise person never stops learning. Which are you choosing to be in your areas of influence? This continuous learning mindset creates a foundation for the third element of wisdom and power, recognizing that values drive decisions. The fool in authority often hasn't clarified their values. They react based on immediate pressures rather than enduring principles. They mistake urgency for importance. They confuse activity with achievement. Without a clear internal compass, their decisions swing wildly depending on circumstances. We've all seen the consequences. The business leader who sacrifices long-term stability for quarterly numbers. The parent who prioritizes peace at any price over necessary difficult conversations. The community figure who abandons stated values when they become inconvenient. None of these people set out to create damage, but damage follows poor decisions as reliably as thunder follows lightning. What values guide your use of power? Have you clearly identified them? Or are you navigating without a map, reacting to whatever seems most pressing in the moment? The difference matters because power amplifies choices. A value-based decision might appear small in the moment, but creates compound benefits over time. A reactive decision might solve an immediate problem while seeding 10 new ones. I learned this lesson through painful experience early in my business career. I had the authority to set prices for our services. A major potential client asked for a significant discount. The revenue would have been substantial even at the reduced rate. The prospect was impressive. The opportunity seemed too good to pass up. I made a reactive decision based on the urgency of wanting that client's business. I slashed our prices without considering the precedent it set, the message it sent about our value, or the strain it would put on delivery with reduced margins. We got the client and regretted it continuously for the next 18 months, as that decision created exactly the problems I should have anticipated. The authority to make pricing decisions without the wisdom to understand their full implications created a situation where everyone lost. That's how foolishness works. It solves one visible problem while creating three invisible ones. Evil has a different pattern. Evil sees the three invisible problems and creates them intentionally. That's why evil is actually easier to address in many ways. Its intentions and results align. Foolishness creates destruction while genuinely believing it's building something worthwhile. Which would you rather face? The person who wants to harm you, or the person who harms you while trying to help? At least with the first, the threat is clear. With the second, you might not recognize the danger until it's too late. This doesn't mean we should prefer evil over foolishness. It means we must be equally vigilant against both, especially in positions of power. And since most of us aren't evil, but all of us have areas of foolishness, this vigilance starts with self-examination. Where do you have authority? Where do your decisions affect others? In those specific domains, what don't you know? What patterns haven't you recognized? What counsel should you be seeking but aren't? These questions feel uncomfortable precisely because they challenge our sense of competence. And that discomfort is exactly what the fool in power avoids. They prefer the comfort of certainty to the growth that comes through acknowledging limitations. But power without this self-awareness becomes dangerous, regardless of intentions. The business owner who doesn't understand cash flow creates financial hardship for employees despite wanting their prosperity. The parent who hasn't addressed their own childhood wounds passes those patterns to their children despite wanting their happiness. The community leader who doesn't grasp human psychology creates division despite wanting unity. Results don't care about intentions. This is the iron law that the fool in power never grasps. They believe wanting good outcomes somehow creates good outcomes. They mistake hopes for strategies. They confuse goals with plans. And because power magnifies everything, these confusions create consequences far beyond what the same limited understanding would produce without authority. Think of a simple example. A person with no medical training giving health advice. If they have no influence, limited harm results. The same person with a platform, a following, credibility in other areas, now their medical misunderstandings can affect thousands. The responsible use of power requires understanding its reach. Where do your words carry weight? Where do your actions set examples? In those specific areas, have you earned the right to that influence through developing actual wisdom? Or are you the fool in authority, creating ripple effects you don't even recognize? Consider the damage that well-intentioned but unwise business regulations create, or educational approaches based on ideology rather than evidence, or foreign policy decisions made without cultural understanding. None of these require malice to produce suffering. They require only power combined with limited perspective. This is why developing wisdom must precede seeking influence. The sequence matters. Develop capacity first, then accept responsibility. The opposite order, gaining authority before developing judgment, creates predictable problems. I've watched aspiring entrepreneurs rush to start companies before understanding business fundamentals. I've seen new managers promoted based on technical skills without people skills. I've observed community organizations hand leadership roles to those most eager to fill them rather than those most prepared to execute them effectively. These decisions follow a common pattern. They prioritize filling a position over considering its impact. They value confidence over competence. They mistake willingness for readiness. And the results follow their own predictable pattern. Initial enthusiasm, followed by mounting problems, escalating stress, and eventually some form of collapse. Not because anyone intended harm, because power amplifies everything, including incompetence. The fool with authority is like someone handed controls to machinery they don't understand. They pull levers with no knowledge of the consequences. They push buttons because they can, not because they should. Their intentions don't determine the outcome. Their understanding does. So what's the alternative? How do we ensure we're not the fool in power within our spheres of influence? It starts with an uncomfortable reality, acknowledging that power requires responsibility, and responsibility requires development. You cannot responsibly hold authority over areas where you've refused to grow your understanding. This development isn't simply accumulating information. Information alone doesn't create wisdom. We're drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The development required is deeper. It involves training your judgment, refining your perception, and most importantly, understanding the patterns that govern outcomes. Let me ask you, can you predict the likely results of your decisions? Can you trace how a choice you make today will affect conditions 6 months from now, a year from now? Can you see not just the immediate consequences, but the second order and third order effects? If not, you're operating with limited vision in whatever areas of authority you hold. And limited vision plus power equals unnecessary problems. The patterns that govern success leave clues everywhere. So do the patterns that reliably create failure. The wise person in power studies both. They learn not just from their own experiences, but from the experiences of others across time and circumstance. They build pattern recognition. They develop what we might call consequential thinking, the ability to follow chains of cause and effect beyond the immediate and obvious. This capacity doesn't develop automatically with age or experience. Many people gain decades of experience. That's really just the same limited understanding repeated year after year. They don't have 20 years of experience. They have 1 year of experience 20 times. True development requires intentional study and honest reflection. It means regularly asking, what patterns am I missing? What consequences haven't I considered? Where might my understanding be incomplete? These questions create discomfort. The fool avoids discomfort. The wise person recognizes discomfort as the sensation of growth and growth as the prerequisite for responsible power. Consider what happens when power combines with this growth mindset. The business leader who continuously develops their understanding creates opportunities and security for employees. The parent who keeps learning creates healthy environments for children. The community figure who remains curious creates sustainable positive change. Their power becomes constructive rather than destructive precisely because it's guided by expanding wisdom rather than fixed understanding. So examine your own areas of authority. Where do you make decisions that affect others? Where does your example influence behavior? In those specific domains, are you continuously developing your capacity, or are you relying on what you already know, which is always less than what you need to know as conditions continuously change? The choice between being the fool in power or the wise person in authority begins with this self-assessment, and it continues with the commitment to growth in precisely the areas where your influence operates. Because while we focus on external foolishness in positions of authority, the incompetent boss, the misguided policymaker, the destructive community, the most important place to address this dangerous combination is within our own sphere of influence. The patterns that create success or failure operate consistently at every scale. The principles that govern wise leadership are the same whether you're guiding a household or a nation. And the responsibility to develop wisdom before wielding power applies to all of us who influence outcomes for others. The hardest truth about wisdom isn't that it's difficult to acquire, it's that most people never seriously try to develop it. They avoid the discomfort of growth, preferring instead the comfort of their current understanding, regardless of how limited it might be. But that approach creates a dangerous vulnerability, because as we've seen, the fool in power, even with good intentions, creates substantial harm. And in some area of your life you have power over your own future at minimum, likely power over others in some capacity. So the question becomes urgent. How do you develop the wisdom necessary to wield that power responsibly? It begins with something most people never master: discernment, the ability to recognize foolishness in its many disguises. Foolishness wears countless masks. Sometimes it appears as absolute certainty, the person who has all the answers, who never doubts, who doesn't recognize complexity. Sometimes it disguises itself as sophistication, using complex language to hide simple errors in reasoning. Often it presents as righteousness, so convinced of its moral standing that it never questions its methods. Do you recognize these patterns in others? More importantly, can you spot them in yourself? Most of us have excellent vision for foolishness when it appears in others. We can immediately identify the colleague who speaks with authority on subjects they clearly don't understand. We quickly spot the public figure making promises that violate basic principles. We easily recognize the family member whose confident opinions exceed their actual knowledge. But what about when we do the exact same things? This blindness to our own limitations creates the perfect conditions for becoming the fool in power. We see clearly when others overreach their understanding. We remain oblivious when we do the same. Breaking this pattern requires developing what the ancients called the examined life. Regular, honest assessment of your own thinking, questioning not just what you believe, but how you formed those beliefs, testing not just your conclusions, but the process that led to them. This self-examination isn't comfortable. It requires admitting what most people spend their lives denying, that your understanding is always incomplete, your perspective always limited, your judgment always fallible. The fool rejects this reality. The wise person embraces it as the starting point for genuine growth. When I was younger, I held strong opinions about how businesses should operate. I could tell you exactly what was wrong with most companies' approaches. I had answers for every management challenge, every organizational problem, and I had never run a business. My confidence wasn't based on experience or results. It came from what I'd read, what made sense to me, what felt right given my limited perspective. In other words, it came from precisely the combination that creates foolishness: incomplete understanding combined with complete certainty. Thankfully, reality provides feedback. When I finally started my own business, those confident theories collided with actual complexity. Many of my assumptions proved naive. Several of my obvious solutions created new problems. Some of my strongest convictions turned out to be entirely wrong. That collision between theory and reality created the opportunity for wisdom, but only because I allowed it to challenge my thinking rather than dismissing the feedback. And that's the crucial difference. The fool in power rejects reality when it contradicts their understanding. The wise person allows reality to refine their understanding, even when that process feels like failure. Ask yourself, when was the last time you genuinely changed your mind about something important? When did you last admit you were wrong? Not about trivial matters, but about significant ones. If you can't remember, you've identified a warning sign. Because wisdom grows through this continuous refinement process. It develops through the willingness to discard what doesn't work, to revise what's incomplete, to expand what's too narrow. The fool, by contrast, defends their current understanding at all costs. They explain away contradicting evidence. They dismiss feedback as irrelevant. They create elaborate justifications for why reality doesn't apply to their situation. You've seen this happen: the business leader whose strategy clearly isn't working, but who doubles down, blaming external factors rather than reconsidering their approach. The parent whose relationship with their child is deteriorating, but who insists the problem is the child's attitude, not their parenting methods. The public figure whose policies create the opposite of their intended effect, but who claims the fault lies with implementation, not the underlying ideas. In each case, power without wisdom creates consequences that continue compounding until reality forces a reckoning. And usually that reckoning comes at great cost to everyone involved. So how do you develop the discernment to recognize foolishness, especially your own, before it creates these cascading consequences? It starts with intellectual humility. Recognizing that what you don't know always exceeds what you do know, regardless of your education or experience. This doesn't mean doubting everything or lacking confidence. It means having an accurate assessment of the boundaries of your understanding. The most dangerous fools aren't those who know nothing. They're those who don't recognize the limits of their knowledge. I've known medical doctors who were brilliant within their specialty, but who made catastrophic business decisions because they assumed their intelligence in one domain transferred automatically to another. I've watched technical experts promoted to management fail spectacularly because they didn't recognize that people's skills require different understanding than technical problems. I've observed talented individual contributors crash into walls of reality when given team leadership roles without proper preparation. None of these people were unintelligent. They simply didn't recognize where their expertise ended and their assumptions began. They didn't cultivate the discernment that distinguishes between what you know and what you merely think you know. This discernment develops through regular reality testing, taking your ideas out of the realm of theory and subjecting them to practical application, seeking feedback not just from those who already agree with you, but from those with different perspectives, measuring results rather than intentions. The fool avoids this testing. They prefer the safety of untested ideas to the vulnerability of discovering where their thinking falls short. But power eventually forces this confrontation with reality, whether you're prepared for it or not. When you hold authority, even modest authority, your decisions create real consequences that can't be rationalized away. The only question is whether you'll develop the wisdom to recognize patterns before those consequences arrive, or learn through the school of hard experience after they do. The wise path requires far more than simply acquiring information. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, yet foolishness remains abundant, perhaps even more so than in previous eras. Because wisdom isn't about the quantity of data you possess. It's about your capacity to interpret that data accurately, to separate signal from noise, to recognize patterns that predict outcomes. This capacity develops through what we might call principled thinking, understanding the underlying principles that govern results rather than focusing solely on surface techniques or tactics. For instance, anyone can learn specific negotiation techniques, but those techniques will be applied foolishly without understanding the principles of human psychology, value creation, and relationship dynamics that make any negotiation successful. The techniques are the what, the principles are the why, and without the why, the what becomes formulaic, rigid, and often counterproductive when circumstances change. The fool collects techniques. The wise person masters principles. You see this distinction everywhere. The business leader who jumps from management fad to management fad without grasping the underlying principles of human motivation and organizational behavior. The parent who tries various discipline approaches without understanding child development principles. The investor chasing hot tips rather than building their knowledge of market fundamentals. In each case, the focus on surface tactics without deeper understanding creates precisely the conditions for foolishness in power, the illusion of knowledge without its substance. So how do you move from collecting information to developing wisdom? It requires what might be called conceptual integration, connecting new information to principles you already understand, building an ever more coherent internal map of how reality works. This integration doesn't happen automatically. It requires reflection, questioning, testing ideas against both evidence and other principles. Most people never develop this habit of integration. They accumulate fragments of information without connecting them. They gather contradictory ideas without reconciling them. They add new data without examining how it fits with or challenges their existing understanding. The result is mental clutter rather than clarity. And clutter creates confusion, especially under pressure, exactly when clear thinking matters most. Consider how often you've watched someone in authority make poor decisions, not because they lacked information, but because they couldn't sort the relevant from the irrelevant, the critical from the peripheral, the principle from the preference. That sorting capacity represents a core element of wisdom. It develops through continuous questioning. What matters most here? What principles apply? What patterns from previous situations might inform this one? What's different about this scenario that might require adjusting my approach? The fool in power skips these questions. They react based on immediate impressions, defaulting to whatever worked last time, or whatever feels comfortable given their preferences, rather than considering first principles. And since power magnifies decisions, these unquestioned reactions create outsized consequences. This brings us to perhaps the most critical aspect of developing wisdom. Your environment shapes your thinking far more than most people recognize. The people you spend time with, the information sources you consume, the feedback you receive or don't receive, all of these continuously mold your perspective, often without conscious awareness. They create what we might call your wisdom environment. Most people give almost no thought to designing this environment intentionally. They absorb whatever information happens to be around them. They spend time with whoever happens to be convenient. They receive feedback from whoever happens to offer it. This passive approach virtually guarantees developing distorted understanding, because without intentional curation, your wisdom environment will naturally skew toward confirmation rather than challenge, comfort rather than growth, reinforcement rather than refinement. The fool in power compounds this problem by surrounding themselves with agreement. They seek inputs that match their existing views. They gather advisors who tell them what they want to hear. They consume information that confirms rather than challenges their perspectives. This pattern appears constantly throughout history and continues today. The business leader who fires those who disagree with their approach. The political figure who dismisses contradicting evidence as biased. The community leader who excludes dissenting from the conversation. In each case, power creates the opportunity to control input, and foolishness uses that control to avoid growth rather than accelerate it. The wise person takes precisely the opposite approach. They intentionally seek perspectives that challenge their thinking. They create systems that ensure they hear disagreement, not just agreement. They purposefully expose themselves to ideas that make them uncomfortable, because they recognize that comfort and growth rarely coexist. Ask yourself, have you designed your wisdom environment, or merely accepted whatever formed around you? Do you actively seek contradicting views, or primarily consume confirming ones? Do you have people in your life who will tell you uncomfortable truths about your blind spots? Or have you perhaps unconsciously selected for those who reinforce your existing views? These questions matter because your wisdom environment determines your capacity for discernment, and discernment determines whether power in your hands creates benefit or harm. Every time power changes hands, a decision gets made, though rarely consciously. Will this authority serve wisdom or foolishness? Will it create value or consume it? Will it leave things better or worse than they were found? This decision happens whether you're stepping into leadership of a global organization or simply taking responsibility for your own life direction. And while we've focused on recognizing foolishness and developing wisdom, the ultimate question remains: how do you transform that wisdom into a legacy that outlasts your direct influence? Because that's the true test of leadership, not what happens while you hold power, but what remains after you've relinquished it. Consider the businesses that collapse shortly after their founder departs, or the families that fracture once the matriarch or patriarch is gone, or the communities that lose their cohesion when a key leader steps away. In each case, what appeared to be strength revealed itself as dependency. What seemed like success proved to be personality-driven rather than principle-based. The fool in power creates dependency. The wise person in authority develops capacity in others. This distinction determines whether your impact creates lasting value or temporary illusions. It determines whether you're building something that can survive your inevitable departure or constructing a house of cards that will collapse when you're no longer holding it together. Most people never consider this longer view. They focus on immediate results, current recognition, present problems. But this short-term thinking virtually guarantees that whatever you build will begin unraveling the moment your direct influence ends. True leadership, the kind that creates generational impact rather than temporary effects, requires shifting from being the source of wisdom to creating systems that develop wisdom in others. What does this look like in practice? First, it means recognizing that your primary job isn't doing the work. It's building the capacity for the work to continue without your direct involvement. The fool in authority makes themselves indispensable. The wise person makes themselves increasingly unnecessary. I learned this lesson the hard way early in my career. I prided myself on being the problem solver, the person who could fix what others couldn't. This created short-term victories, but long-term problems. Teams became dependent on my involvement rather than developing their own capacity. Projects stalled when I wasn't available. The entire operation centered around my input. This wasn't leadership, it was a sophisticated form of self-importance masquerading as indispensability. Real leadership takes the opposite approach. It systematically transfers knowledge, develops capability in others, creates independent judgment rather than dependency on the leader's judgment. In each case, the first approach creates temporary results dependent on the leader's continued involvement. The second builds lasting capacity that survives their departure. Ask yourself, if you stepped away from your areas of responsibility tomorrow, what would happen? Would systems continue functioning, or would they begin to break down? Would others step forward with developed capacity, or would a leadership vacuum emerge? Your honest assessment reveals whether you're building dependency or developing capacity. This capacity development forms the foundation of what we might call legacy thinking, considering not just immediate outcomes, but generational impact. Most people never adopt this perspective. They react to present circumstances, solve immediate problems, chase current opportunities. But this approach, while sometimes necessary for survival, creates nothing that outlasts direct involvement. Legacy thinking asks different questions. What remains when I'm gone? What continues producing results without my presence? What have I truly built versus merely controlled? These questions shift focus from activity to impact, from authority to influence, from power over to power through. Practical legacy building starts with creating what we might call wisdom systems, approaches that embed principles rather than depending on personalities. These systems include clear values that guide decisions even when you're not present to make them. Not vague aspirational statements, but concrete behavioral standards that answer the question, how do we operate here? Decision frameworks that develop judgment in others rather than dependency on your judgment. Not rigid rules, but principled approaches that teach people how to think rather than what to think. Feedback mechanisms that provide reality testing regardless of hierarchy. Not just top-down evaluation, but multi-directional input that ensures no one's perspective, including the leader's, remains unchallenged. Development pathways that continuously expand capacity throughout the organization, family, or community. Not just skills training, but wisdom cultivation that grows people's ability to navigate complexity independently. The fool in power ignores these systems, preferring the immediate gratification of direct control to the delayed satisfaction of developing capacity in others. They measure success by personal recognition rather than organizational resilience. They evaluate results by current metrics rather than sustainability. And because power allows this short-term approach to continue temporarily without obvious negative consequences, the pattern persists until reality eventually forces a reckoning, usually after significant damage has occurred. You've seen this play out numerous times. The founder whose company implodes after their departure because they built everything around their personality rather than transferable principles. The parent whose adult children struggle with independence because they were taught compliance rather than judgment. The community organization that dissolves after a key leader steps down because systems for developing new leadership never existed. In each case, what appeared successful revealed itself as fundamentally fragile, precisely because it depended on a single source of direction rather than distributed capacity. Building distributed capacity requires something most people in authority find uncomfortable, allowing others to make mistakes you could prevent, giving them responsibility before they've proven themselves completely ready, permitting them to learn through experience rather than instruction. The fool in power avoids these discomforts. They micromanage to prevent errors. They withhold authority until others demonstrate perfection. They prescribe detailed instructions rather than teaching principles. This approach creates the illusion of excellence in the short term. Mistakes get prevented. Standards remain high. Control stays tight, but it simultaneously guarantees fragility in the long term because it builds dependency rather than capacity. True legacy thinking accepts short-term inefficiency for long-term resilience. It recognizes that people develop judgment through making recoverable mistakes, not through perfect execution of someone else's instructions. It understands that systems grow stronger through stress testing rather than protection from all pressure. This perspective represents perhaps the most difficult transition for anyone in authority, from preventing all problems to allowing productive struggle. The wise leader distinguishes between mistakes that create learning and those that create disaster, permitting the first while establishing boundaries that prevent the second. Most leaders never make this transition. They remain trapped in what we might call the competence paradox. The more capable you are at doing something yourself, the harder it becomes to develop that capability in others. Because watching someone struggle through what you could accomplish easily creates genuine discomfort. But legacy requires pushing through this discomfort. It demands focusing on long-term capacity development even when short-term intervention would be easier. Ask yourself, where are you allowing productive struggle that develops capacity in others? Where are you intervening unnecessarily because it feels better to solve problems yourself? Your answers reveal whether you're building dependency or legacy. This capacity development extends beyond direct reports or family members. True legacy thinking considers impact on larger systems, the industry, the community, the society. It asks, how does my use of power affect not just those immediately connected to me, but the broader context within which I operate? The fool in authority ignores these wider ripple effects. They optimize for personal or organizational gain without considering systemic impacts. They extract value rather than creating it. They focus on competition rather than contribution. This narrow perspective creates what appears to be success while simultaneously undermining the conditions that make that success possible long term. The business that depletes environmental resources it depends on. The family that achieves financial prosperity while fracturing relationships. The community organization that wins battles while losing community trust. In each case, what looks like winning creates the seeds of eventual loss because it considers too small a system in too short a time frame. Legacy thinking expands both dimensions. It considers impacts beyond direct control and beyond immediate time horizons. It recognizes that true success requires contribution to the health of the larger systems within which you operate. This expanded perspective changes decision making. It shifts the question from what's best for me to what's best for the system. It recognizes that genuine self-interest includes the health of the environments upon which you depend. The wise use of power creates value in expanding circles for yourself, for those you directly influence, for the broader systems within which you function. The foolish use of power extracts value from those same circles, creating what appears to be personal gain while actually diminishing the resources that sustain that gain. You can observe this distinction everywhere. The business leader who builds community while building company versus the one who sacrifices community for company. The parent who strengthens family ties through their approach versus the one who achieves compliance at the cost of connection. The community figure who builds bridges across differences versus the one who gains influence through creating division. In each case, the first approach creates sustainable value while the second produces temporary advantage that inevitably collapses because it damages the very systems it depends upon. This brings us to what might be the most important element of creating a legacy of wise leadership: developing what we might call principle-based opportunism. Most people operate from either rigid principles that ignore opportunity or opportunism that ignores principles. The first creates irrelevance as conditions change. The second creates short-term gain followed by long-term consequences as violated principles exact their price. The wise leader integrates both elements. They maintain unwavering commitment to core principles while demonstrating flexibility in how those principles get applied as conditions change. They distinguish between what must remain constant and what must continuously adapt.